I'm delighted to welcome the first speaker in this afternoon's session on hungry children, and that's Dr. Mary Clare Martin. Mary Clare is the founder of the Children's History Society. She is based in the Centre for the Study of Play and Recreation within the Institute of Lifecourse Development at the University of Greenwich, and also convenes the Lifecourse seminar at the IHR, which we consider a kind of sister seminar to our History of Education seminar. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Mary Clare.
Hello, welcome to this event. This first paper will be partly by way of introduction to the papers that are coming. So school dinners, concrete chips, soggy semolina, quick, I feel sick, far too late, done it on a plate. So many thanks to Kate Bradley and Mark Freeman for teaching me this. So first of all, I'm going to talk about a prequel. Feeding communities is nothing new. And in 1798, Thomas Bernard, who was the co-founder of the Society for Bettering the Comfort Condition and Increasing the Comforts of the Poor, reported on a scheme providing hot dinners for 77 people, mainly children, including convalescents at home, in the market town of Epping. And as I put in the quotation, it is a melancholy truth, and the concealment will prevent the correction of the evil, that the poor of England, in a country of plenty, are not properly fed. Now, this school originated in a spinning school, so children did not have to go home for lunch, and later included workhouse inmates. Parents paid 6pence a week for each child. Rich people paid for the dinners of some of the deserving poor. So this very little known, but apparently highly effective scheme worked on the assumption that there was an understanding that the poor were badly fed, that frequently, or if not always, was not their fault, and that people who had more resources should be doing something about it. A much later example in Walthamstow in 1911 was when children were sent home with cans of school dinner, which were for the whole family. So there was an acknowledgement that whole families needed food, not just children. So a little bit about the context of 19th century education. In the 1800s, there were a lot of schools for poor children. Some have been founded in the 18th century, linked to the SPCK, which is a charitable society. There were schools of industry that promoted work by children. And in the 19th century, networks developed affiliated to charitable societies, the National Society and the British and Foreign School Society. So that by the time education became compulsory in 1880 for children aged 5 to 10 years, there was already a national network of schools, as we will see. The 1870 Education Act, often misunderstood, established school boards in areas of insufficient school accommodation. The principle was a school place for every child, but it was not compulsory or free. The point I want to emphasize in this presentation is the key role of the voluntary sector in providing school meals and in fundraising. Children in the schools I've mentioned had treats on special occasions and festivals. Ragged schools were founded for poor children after 1844 in many cities. Local newspapers played a key role, just as they have in the 21st century, fundraising for free dinners. One example is the Referee in London, the Clarion in Bradford. And so by 1904, 16% of children had school meals provided by voluntary societies. So I want to focus on children's experiences of school meals, and this is obviously a very difficult topic to access. And one of the main ways we can do this is through life story writing written long after the event. Here are some examples of this. Some of these were written as autobiographies, Lark Rise and A Child in the Forest, about an Oxfordshire village and the Forest of Dean. And then there are small collections of very short accounts derived from oral history. Cumbrian Women Remember, Children of the Revolution. So one of the key questions we'll be considering in the panel is the methodology about recovering experiences of school food. So the rest of my talk will be looking at 5 different case studies or scenarios for how children might have had meals at school from the 19th into the 20th century. And the first is packed lunch. Children did have packed lunch in the 1800s. Rural children often had to walk a mile or more to school. Sometimes they took warm potatoes from the fire for a snack, or pieces of bread and lard or treacle. And Pamela Horn in The Victorian Country Child recaptured some experiences. For example, one child remembered how there was only one girl in their class and they used to cluster around the fire. Only one girl had proper sandwiches with meat. She toasted it on a knitting needle in front of the fire. And the author of this account said their own pieces of bread and seam or lard didn't taste as good as they should have, watching this child eating her meat. Flora Thompson in Lark Rise talked about walking to school. They carried their lunches on their backs in rush baskets, and they foraged in the fields for anything they could find: turnips, pea shucks, and green hawthorn. Then there's urban charity, my second case study. So by the 1880s, religious missions in urban areas often provided free hot meals. And the account of Arthur Harding, which was edited by Raphael Samuel, described going to a different mission every day to get a free hot meal. In Bradford in the 1890s, Cinderella clubs were supported by the Socialist Clarion newspaper. These were not on a daily basis. The idea was to have children to have a blowout to eat as much as they could about once a week. Margaret Macmillan, who is an independent Labour Party member in Bradford, on the Bradford School Board, and campaigned for school bars funded on the rates, hated seeing children encouraged to stuff themselves with food. She thought this was very disrespectful to children and that they should have flowers on the table. The meal should be a pleasant experience. And she considered conditions after the 1906 Act, which we'll come on to, very degrading. So one of the other questions we'll be thinking about is, was this kind of sentiment out of respect for the child's experience, or was it part of a middle-class civilizing mission? Third case study is rural charity. Now, occasionally rural parishes did provide hot meals. In the mid-19th century in Finmore in Oxfordshire, there was hot soup dinner 2 days a week, prepared by the rector's wife. A new school in Rousden provided hot penny dinners from the first. And the most enthusiastic writer was Winifred Foley, who wrote In the Forest of Dean. And first of all, she talked about children being lucky who went off to the sanatorium if they had TB. She also talked about how during strikes, everyone was so hungry, there just was not enough to eat. But then she talked about how we, meaning the school children, had some good luck too, because meals had been mysteriously provided. Now it was meat every day, beautiful stews, corned beef, mince, and pudding as well, rice pudding made with milk, jam roly-poly, and crowning delicacy, treacle pudding. And Foley also was prodded to ask for more and did get some, though afterwards she was teased for this, called the Head's Little Pudding Girl. So now we'll come on to my fourth case study. So by the early 20th century, under the Education Provision of Meals Act, there is very grudging state funding, but children often remembered it going hand in hand with humiliation. Local authorities were allowed to provide meals, but they were supposed to try and get the cost back from the parents. It was all very controversial. By 1921, under another act, medical officers were supposed to decide whether children should have meals on grounds of possible malnutrition. Obviously, quite difficult to judge whether a child is likely to be malnourished in the future as well as malnourished in the present. And most schools did not have canteens until after the 1944 Education Act. So here are some examples. In Maryport in Cumberland, in the 1910s to 1930s, children who had free meals had to go to the Coffee Tavern in Sandhurst House Street. The school did not have a canteen and they felt marked out. Another example from Bermondsey is Jim Green, who remembered that children who went to school dinners and the cleansing station were looked down as outcasts. So this issue of feeling marked out and humiliated, again, is still with us. Another issue is politicization. It was a real dilemma from the 1920s onwards about whether strikers' children should have free meals. Some politicians felt this looked like rewarding the strikers. Others, that it was not right to penalize strikers' children. And one example from the collection Children of the Revolution was Anne Kane, born in 1942. She was the daughter of a Communist Party leader from South Yorkshire and one of 3 siblings attending a grammar school, which was quite unusual for 3 children to succeed in getting into a grammar school from the same family. And this was her memory. Because the strike went on for so long, the miners' children were given free school dinners. So for the duration of the strike, we had to bring in a letter asking for the dinners and had to stand up in class with it. I remember in a maths class, I was the only person in the class who had brought in this sort of blank letter asking for school dinners. And I remember the maths teacher saying he would have expected some of the others to be asking, but not me, because he thought this strike was being organised by the communists. And he implied it was all my father's fault and we shouldn't be getting the free school dinners. And I remember being slightly embarrassed by that. So here's an example of teachers actively humiliating children. And school dinners was, and still is, a very political issue. In the early 20th century, many people thought that this was a way to cure poverty. And we'll dwell later on in the session on why this is still a problem. So concluding thoughts, was the food good? We've heard from Winifred Foley, but it's also, unfortunately, some of the providers didn't believe they should be providing food. And one school care committee, this was a voluntary committee attached to many schools, tried to make the food as unappetizing as possible. Even in the 1960s, decisions were still being made by volunteers about deservingness, who actually deserved to have free school meals. Peter Atkins has argued that baby boomers had mainly unpleasant memories of school dinners. But on the other hand, from anecdotal evidence, some rural children described free school meals as a godsend. So thank you for listening, and we're going to explore these themes later on in the session.
It's lovely to see everybody. I wasn't sure how many people to expect, but it's lovely to see so many, and gives me hope that these kinds of things really do work. So I shall get straight into it. I may not get through all of this, so if I don't worry. As it's being recorded, you can look at the slides at your leisure. So I'll just jump into sensory history. I'm currently exploring the possibilities for sensory histories of school meals. So just to give a little bit of background about the approach that I'm trying to use here. So sensory history is a good definition provided by Gary in a 2011 article. So sensory history involves foregrounding the non-cognitive dimensions of sensation, including the senses of smell, sound, touch, taste, and sight. And I'm thinking at the moment about whether it's actually possible to understand how people in the past perceived their world in sensory terms. So can we ever really understand what it's like, what it was like to be in a 19th century or a 20th century, early 20th century school, what they smelled, what they sounded like. And sensory history builds on earlier work by French historians in particular. So we have a vast array of histories of sense in classical antiquity, modern France, histories of touch in early modern Europe, 18th century America, histories of sound in colonial Australia, and taste in medieval England and the 18th century transatlantic world. And most recently, historians have begun to think about intersensoriality, so how the senses work together and in concert rather than in isolation. So there's a burgeoning history in this field. And since its beginnings, sensory histories have shown the important role which the senses have played in the history of power and social relations. So historians like Peter Hoffer and Alain Corbin have introduced terms such as sensuous etiquette and sensory regimes to describe the process whereby the training of the senses is used to inculcate desirable characteristics in poor and working class children, in prisoners, hospital patients, and other what they call contained populations. So there's obviously a Foucauldian dimension to this as well. Insofar as the history of school meals has been looked at through the lens of sensory history, it's tended to follow this narrative, I think, of school feeding as a sensory training of poor children by the state and by state-funded actors. Kathy Burke commented in her work on the edible landscape of schools in 2005 that historians have mainly been concerned to demonstrate how sensory language was used to mark out the inferiority of working class children and their need to be reformed. And she's talking specifically about a UK context here. She describes the introduction of the school meal service in England and Wales under the 1906 Act as being, quote, associated with notions of progress, advancement and civilization. So that goes back to what Mary Clare was saying earlier about school meals possibly being part of the civilizing mission. And Hayton has recently taken this interpretation further, looking at the notion of smellscapes, which I love as a concept. I think they're really interesting. And specifically the use of smell to demarcate class boundaries. And he focuses on the 1860s and the sanitary reform movement, when he writes, and I quote, attention increasingly turned to people's effluvia, breath and body odor. So you can get some really nice descriptions in this. He describes a process of what he calls the colonization of the world of poor children, in which the absence of smell becomes synonymous with a range of civil values, such as self-control, order, and patriotism. And a wonderful phrase, odorous others, were identified as potential disruptors of moral order. And that's a phrase I take up a little bit later on. He quotes a teacher in Belgium in 1907 describing a visit to his pupils' poor homes, and he describes their sordid slums in their dank upstairs room with their ever-lingering odour of poor people. So this is the sense in which a sense of smell is actually aligned, a keen sense of smell is aligned with someone from the upper class, and smelling badly is something aligned with the poor. What these approaches don't tell us much about, though, is how the children themselves experience hunger and school feeding, whether from their perspective, this colonizing project was actually successful. And this is something which Yinka, Mary Clare and I wanted to explore in the original panel for BERA. So both Burke and Tyson hint at the possibility of resistance. Kathy Burke describes food and drink in schools potentially being a site of contested desires, a space where authority and resistance are exercised. And Tyson admits that there must have been children who resisted the open air diet that he looks at, but comments that this is difficult to establish as ego documents offering insight into the sensory experiences of children are in short supply. So moving on, I want to suggest that that's not necessarily the case. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sources that Mary Clare has already referenced, particularly autobiographies, where people are looking back. And obviously that is potentially problematic methodologically in terms of, how accurately people remember and whether those memories can be taken as authentic experiences of childhood. But they're certainly worth pursuing even with those caveats. So these are a few of the sources that I've used for this paper and for the project that lies behind it. So the Burnett collection of working class autobiography at Burnell, the Archive of Working Class Writing Online, which is a big collaborative project designed to put all of these materials on the internet, a range of oral history projects, including the hundreds and thousands of childhood memories projects run by the Children's Society about 15 years ago now, and school archives. In recent years, there have been a lot of centenaries and bicentenaries of schools, and these have launched a lot of digitization projects to put school archives online. So there's a lot of new material becoming available. So that's really exciting as well. And I've just put a picture up there of the 200th anniversary of Hayton School Foundation in Carlisle. I was involved with the Heritage Lottery project to make a film about their bicentenary and putting their archives online. So in what time remains to me, and I see I'm running out of time, I just want to give an indication of some of the responses that children, sensory responses that children give to school dinners. Here I am drawing on the same autobiography as Mary Clare used, which we talked about on Monday when we had a quick pre-meeting. And I want to suggest that some accounts do actually reinforce the demarcation of classes through sensory distinctions and suggest the civilizing role of food provided by the state. So Winifred Foley, in her autobiography, A Child in the Forest, which looks back at her childhood in the 1920s, gives some pretty stark details about the conditions that she grew up in. So she talks about tuberculosis, malnutrition, and village children being sent to sanatoria. And I just think it's really interesting, her response to that. She said they were lucky. And then Mary Clare told us about the good luck that the school children received by having free dinners. But the contrast I want to point out is the one she draws with her own mother. And she says, our mum tried to get some sort of meat for Sunday dinner, but now it was meat every day. Beautiful stews, corned beef, mince. So this idea that what the state provided was better than what she was getting at home. And again, to refer to someone mentioned by Mary Clare, Margaret Macmillan, in an appeal for memories on the 100th anniversary of the birth of Margaret Macmillan, and I think this is in the Greenwich archive, University of Greenwich archive, quite a few accounts of their memories of being a child in the Deptford nursery or baby camp run by the Macmillan sisters. Again, it gives a similar impression. This particular former student, Mrs. Stygier, talks about it was difficult to make people realise what a wonderful person Miss Macmillan was unless they knew what Deptford was like many years ago. Then they would understand. The children were dirty, they had no shoes. When I came to the tall wooden gate of the baby camp and passed through, it seemed to me a veritable paradise. And she describes children looking like delphiniums and smelling like flowers. So the contrast in terms of sensory experience is quite marked. However, there's a range of responses that children share, and it's really important to point out the complexity of the sensory responses that you encounter. Margaret Watson, who was born in 1907 in inner city Glasgow, is an interesting case. She is aware of the category that she was put into, which she called the unfortunates. So she says, we went to school for breakfast and lunch, and when school ended, the unfortunates stayed in school for tea at 4:30. But if you look at how she responds to it, she says, bread, cheese, a huge Paris bun, we loved it. So in other words, it's not the category of unfortunates that bothers her. She actually says, we felt no shame, just full bellies. So there's this idea that even though they were aware of that categorization, it didn't hold a particular stigma for them at the time. And other children seem to have reacted along the lines predicted by Hebb, by maintaining their previous diets and rejecting school meals. So Amy Gomm is another example of a girl who was born in 1899 in Oxfordshire, also in a rural village. And Amy confessed to disliking school dinners and finding them nauseating. She vastly preferred what she called her mother's dinner bags, which contained delicacies, including bacon, cheese, boiled eggs, dough cake, and a wedge of cold spotted dick. And I like the phrase, or even a currant turnover. That was obviously a particular treat. Kay Garrett, born in 1899 in Hammersmith, is another good example. She disparaged school meals as sludge and records proudly in her memoir that her mother could make a nutritious and delicious family meal for only a sixpence, and actually proceeded to list the ingredients that her mother would regularly buy. And I won't read through them all because I don't have time. But just to underline a couple of the words that she uses, she talks about delicious slow-cooked stews and thick slices of suet pudding dripping with lovely golden syrup. Exactly very similar descriptions to Winifred Foley's language about school meals, but this is obviously the experience of home dinners being taken in the evenings. And then the response ranges from loving school dinners, really appreciating them aesthetically, to resenting what they were given. Nora Adams, who was born in 1901, and slightly different experience. She was brought up in a Barnardo's home for girls at Barkingside in Essex. And in her memoir, she recalls feelings of bitter resentment when being forced to go without supper on Founders' Day, when members of the public looked around Barkingside grounds and had their dinner in the cottages where the girls normally ate. So whilst the visitors were allowed to use what she called fancy crockery, the children were only allowed simple plates and mugs. How I hate the sight of enamel cups and plates, absolutely nauseating, she writes. They like the word nauseating, I've noticed this. That is why I do like a dainty cup and saucer now. You can see how that's affected her attitudes towards eating and the sensory nature of eating later in life. And my final example is Guy Oates. the only boy actually in the sample I'm using today, who attended the Yorkshire Society School in Lambeth. And he writes about never being given any nice food, gravy, custard, sauces or syrup. It's something to do with wartime privations and rations, obviously, during the First World War. But he said often he would get no breakfast at all, and sometimes no tea as well on the same day. And looking back, he recalls the feeling of having his dignity lowered by the experience, which I thought is an interesting reflection. Obviously, perhaps it didn't quite equate to how he felt at the time, but it's interesting that he puts it in those terms. And actually, he devised a secret plan to secret away the jam and bread that was given as supper to the older boys, because he helped to serve it out. And he tells about hiding it under his jumper and eating it in the bathroom late at night, and what he called his jammy tummy, which made me smile, and pointed to some of the ways in which children got around the rules and regulations around school dinners. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say a little bit about sensory history as a promising approach to trying to access children's experiences and perceptions of school feeding. The value of using sources like autobiographies, memoirs, oral histories, and school archives, and really just pointing to the range of emotional, sensory, and aesthetic responses that children have had to school meals in this period. Some reinforcing the demarcation between the classes, others ignoring it, resenting it, or even seeking in their own way to rebel against it. Thank you very much. That's me done. I shall stop sharing. Georgina?
Yep, I'm back on.
Sorry, is that okay?
Okay, thanks for having me. So I stopped working as gardener in residence in 2018 when I moved abroad to Greece. So this is kind of reflections on those years from 2013 to 18. And over the summer I had a long conversation with the head teacher there about what kind of was going on during the lockdown period, because this school's been on the news a lot in the last few months in terms of their response to the coronavirus pandemic and how they used that as a way to transform the school food culture. So I'm going to start by just giving a bit of background on the school. It's called Manorfield Primary, and it's in Tower Hamlets in East London, and it sits in the first and third constituencies for food poverty in the UK. And the uptake of free school meals is about 50%, according to the last government figures. And I'm going to talk a lot about the head teacher, Paul Jackson, who I got a lot of the kind of information on what's happened recently from, because he's quite an interesting head teacher in that he's really pushed to put school meals and a wider culture of talking about food at the forefront of school policy. He started in 2016. And so they used during the lockdown, food became the vehicle for a rich conversation around food, and families were coming into the school to kind of pick up their food packages, and this allowed for a kind of regular conversation around the food that was being consumed and provided. So, school meals prior to lockdown. So in 2018, Manorfield had disengaged from Tower Hamlets catering service. The school catering staff, who were typically low paid and with minimal training in food, were providing the meals. They were kept on, but a new management kind of shifted the focus of the meals. They became a bit more kind of environmentally aware, so the menu became more vegetarian. So still had a roast dinner on Wednesdays and fish on Fridays, but the spaghetti bolognese, they started to use corn mince, and the pork sausages became corn sausages. And this was without kids really knowing or being told of these changes. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about my role as school gardener and how this then feeds in with the the school feeding. So I was employed in 2017 at Manorfield. I'd already worked for Paul in a different school as the gardener. A huge garden was built in the middle of the playground. This picture's from when it was all empty in January 2017, and the next picture is a couple of years later when it was all planted up. At the same time, a chef in residence was employed. Now, they weren't working in the school canteen, but they were doing cookery sessions outside of the school canteen, linking into the national curriculum. The chef in residence would try and use as much of the produce from the garden as possible, and we worked together a lot as a team. So why have a school garden at all, and why have a school garden? So lots of schools do have school gardens now. Fewer schools have gardeners, and I think it's really important to mention that Paul saw it as something vitally important to have the gardener there, because a class teacher will often get overwhelmed by all the things they have to do, and it's good to have someone there all the time with the expertise to run classes throughout the day. And yeah, I'll just read from these slides now. So food growing gives children a direct link back to the school system and a concrete experience of how food is grown. So it's a really practical way to engage with food. We often find that children are far more likely to eat vegetables if they've planted, nurtured and harvested themselves. So there's a great sense of satisfaction that I noticed from kids being involved in the whole process and being able to harvest their own vegetables. And the top picture, you can see these are kids from the summer school who were coming in during the summer, and they got to take all of those vegetables home. And the bottom picture is of some year 2 students who've just harvested a salad, big happy faces. So often it's the first time a child will taste a particular vegetable or try new foods really confidently in this kind of environment where they've kind of been engaged with the whole process. So it was recognised by the head teacher that real change could only happen through dedicating a full-time member of staff to food growing. Now we can see that it enriches the entire curriculum from science, maths and geography to art, design and languages. So lots of different lessons were being taught out in the garden. Lots of science lessons, they would do lots of drawing in the garden. And you can see a nursery child there with some potatoes. It also fosters a sense of nurture and sensitivity. So it's a really fantastic thing to do with kids with special educational needs or special behaviour needs. So you can see here, one of the kids is stroking the seedlings. This is a technique that actually encourages stronger growth, and it's really, really therapeutic. And here's a couple of year 2 students sowing seeds. So it's really good to develop abstract thinking as well, and in a very relaxing environment. So you're seeing that seed is going to become a vegetable. Also brilliant having a school garden to build a community. So parent and staff engagement. This is a member of staff picking kodu, which is, we call it bottle gourd, and it grows all over the front gardens in Tower Hamlets. And it was a really good way to get parents interested in the garden, growing kind of foods they were familiar with, and then we would cook them in the cooking club. So we ran a parent cooking course during weekdays. And the idea with the cooking courses, again, it was to use as much produce from the garden as possible, but less so about kind of teaching how to cook, more about kind of sharing recipes, fostering a sense of engagement and talking about what their children like to eat. And then on the last session of every term, they'd be allowed to come with their children and all cook together. At the end of that course, we made this cookbook. So that was for kids to take home and cook over the summer together, with recipes we'd done in class and in the parent group, using stuff from the garden. So that's a bit of background about my role as school gardener, but I wanted to talk about what happened during the coronavirus pandemic, where the school remained open for vulnerable children and the children of key workers, and became a kind of hub for the community. So I'm going to talk a bit about that now, what happened during the lockdown. So most of the catering staff were actually lost in the first few weeks due to sickness, or because they were shielding vulnerable members of their family. So Paul Jackson, the head teacher, had to think about what he was going to do to feed those coming in. And also all of those children eligible for free school meals needed to be fed in some way. The government school voucher scheme hadn't yet come into play. So here's what happened. So due to Paul's kind of way of making partnerships and networks, he'd already built up a relationship with the Dorchester Hotel in London, and he was able to borrow a head chef who was on furlough because all the restaurants had closed by then, and he came into the school canteen and started cooking for the children who were attending school. So fewer pupils now, only about 30 pupils, and a more flexible school timetable meant that staff could sit and eat with the children at lunchtime. And this is Michi Chan, who is the head chef at the Dorchester Hotel. So Paul, the head teacher, observed that everything slowed down. Unlike the conveyor belt school meals served before lockdown to 700 children plus, within this calmer and quieter environment, children were being braver and trying different foods, making more adventurous choices. The better quality meals could be produced at the same cost as before under the supervision of an expert chef. So all the ingredients were exactly the same as with the previous catering company. But as you can see in the photo, kind of a lot more interesting in terms of presentation and how the food's being put together. So we're seeing school dinners being transformed during this period. As the weeks went by, the school started receiving donations, one of them being from Ottolenghi restaurants, who also lent a bunch of their chefs to the school canteen who were on furlough. And new high quality ingredients became available for the school dinners, such as walnuts and olives and lots of fresh vegetables. So children were spending much more of the morning out in the garden and were harvesting vegetables that the kitchen were able to use. So I'm using a lot of pictures here from the school Twitter feed because I think they highlight what was going on really well. Here you can see some of the things the children have been making, and they were making them with the school chef and then eating them at lunchtime. So we've got custard yo-yos and we've got brownies. So with these fresh, high quality ingredients and a team of professional chefs, school dinners had been transformed. Children continued to experiment with new foods, encouraged by sitting with school staff, but also having an involvement in the whole process through gardening and participating in cooking classes with the chefs. So this was something as school gardener I always struggled with, making the kind of leap from having kids excited about food in the garden and maybe trying a salad in the garden, but then not necessarily choosing salad for their school meal. And at the same time, the school was becoming a food bank. Donated food continued to be delivered in large quantities. And what happened was the school became a hub for the whole area, serving these food bags to all the families that were entitled to free school meals. They put the teacher in charge of logistics along with a local volunteer, and the school were able to act as a collection point for local families and other primary schools in the area. So these are some pictures of the school bags that were being given out. And here's some pictures of local community members picking up their bags. This is John Biggs, who's the mayor of Tower Hamlets, come to visit for the day, and a couple of teachers giving out the school bags. So if we're looking at the school bags versus free school meal vouchers, some schools chose to go down the free school meal voucher route. Now, in terms of the school bag, they consisted of donated food from different food banks. school budget. So the government give a subsidy of £11.50 a week for school meals. So that's £2.30 per day for a school meal per child. They also did a lot of fundraising and had volunteers packing bags and a bike charity kind of delivering the bags to those who weren't attending school. If we're looking at vouchers, where the money goes directly to the parents, well, the vouchers were slow to come into use, and there was concern that there would be less value for money as families couldn't buy wholesale as the caterers could, and so their money wouldn't go as far in the supermarkets, which relates to what Mary Clare was saying also about buying wholesale can be so much better value for families. There were also claims that vouchers would cause job losses. So this was a really interesting article I found, where a charity called School Food Matters, who we used to have a lot to do with actually during the time I was working there, they were putting pressure on the government to, instead of giving money directly to families, to instead spend the cash on caterers. And they say this will allow for better purchasing in terms of food quality and quantity, and enable schools to continue to provide food and other support for the most vulnerable children. However, there's also discrepancies in what the catering services are able to provide. This is a tweet from an angry head teacher in Bristol who takes a photo of what the catering team at his school were providing for free school meal children. He says, if you're a child on free school meals in Bristol, this is what you get for the week. The school pays the contractor £11 for this. Check out the butter. We have 185 of these to distribute. Shameful. So it's all kind of junk food. That was in March. So I know there were distribution problems at that point. You can read the full quotes a bit later. I think I'm probably out of time. So almost done. Just to round up, going forward into autumn term 2020, post-lockdown. So the school has reopened. All the children are back at school. And as things go back to normal, the school reverted to the old team of catering staff, and Paul Jackson created a new position called chef manager. So the way he sees, envisions changing is that having a professional chef who can manage the current catering team will really improve school meals and make them more imaginative, more healthy. And he gave me an example when I was interviewing him, and he said the first week back in autumn, the lunch bags were given out to those children only staying for the morning. They contained cheese, basil, and a tomato wrap. Some parents rang up to say their children wouldn't eat the wrap because they didn't like the look of the green stuff. So you can see putting basil in a wrap. It makes it more fancy, more healthy, but it's kind of putting people off. So just to finish, I just wanted to raise the following points maybe for discussion. We're seeing really different responses across the board, but there's a conflict in the relationships between the role of the school, the state, the charity sector, in terms of feeding the most vulnerable children in schools. Whose responsibility is the provision of food? And how do we see the parents and children receiving the meals? As passive consumers or active participants? So, thank you for having me. And yeah, look forward to discussing some of these points.
Okay, well, welcome back everybody after the break. We now have three additional papers, Gary, Yinka and Gopinder. I'm going to start with Gary, and we'll run in order as we did before, and then we'll have time at the end for questions, comments on those three papers, and then a wider discussion, bringing it in themes that might cut across anything we've heard today. So Gary obviously needs no introduction as my co-chair of the IHR History of Education seminar, and of course the Brian Simon Professor of History of Education at the Institute of Education. And I'm sure he's got plenty of books he could plug, but we're not going to give Gary any more chance to do that, because I think it's time we move on really quickly to Gary's paper.
I'm well able to do that anyway. Thank you very much indeed for all of that. Can I say, before I say anything else, what a wonderful session it's been so far. If I say it's been a very rich topic, I'm sure you'll understand what I mean. And wonderful to see so many colleagues, friends and colleagues from around the world who normally wouldn't have a chance to get to our sessions, and it's really lovely to see you all. I want to talk about the rise and fall of the school meals service, which really follows on really quite nicely, I think, from the presentations earlier. And in particular, I think, from Holly's final remarks about whether the provision and the receipt of food was passive or active, and really trying to dig into that kind of question a little bit more. Next slide. Okay. The outline, which I've got on the next slide, is what I'd like to talk about today. As with Heather, I don't know whether I'll get all the way through it, but gives you an indication of what I wanted to talk about. And all those fascinating anecdotes that we were hearing towards the end of the last session, I'm wanting to try to analyze those, if I can, in terms of the manipulation of supply and demand over changing social and political context. I'm not going to try to start from the 1906 Act. I think there's been quite a lot written on that actually already, but really from the 1930s and the Second World War and the school meal service, which really peaked in the 1950s. The role of the 1944 Education Act itself, which I think was the real formative legislation which led to school meal service becoming what was regarded as a real social institution, part of the curriculum and the general life of the school, quite central. Very unusually in the 1940s, just about the only thing which was compulsory apart from religious instruction. So seen as a social institution, but then a slow failure of demand and a withdrawal of supply. And I'm seeing those going alongside each other, that the reduction of demand and the withdrawal of supply are manipulated in a very slow process of managed decline from the 1950s onwards, far before Margaret Thatcher got her hands on it. Next slide, please. So here we are with a few starting points, which I think are useful for this topic. Excellent American historian Sheldon Rothblatt, who some time ago wrote a nice little piece called Supply and Demand, the Two Histories of English Education. As he said, the history of working class education in England is usually written from the supply side in the 20th century as a matter of welfare reform. But market forces, regarded not as an inflexible tool, but as a very flexible kind of concept, involving the great variety of social rules and rule regimes that govern market contact, entry and exit, the process of negotiation and mediation, the false starts and successes, and even the efforts taken to avoid market discipline that occur when parties engage in transactions. Next slide. Another starting point is a very interesting history by another, I think, American historian, James Verman, Hunger, A Modern History. And one of his chapters looks at the role of the state in providing school meals, the emergence of the view that it was the responsibility of the state in some way to provide school meals, and saying, in part, the idea was to create a sanitary and congenial space for school meals, but also to provide the physical accoutrements of civility that were often absent from the poorest homes, where food went directly from hand to mouth, involving tables and chairs, plates, cups, cutlery, and even tablecloths and flowers. Next slide. I'm wanting really to look, I don't think it was so much the First World War as the Second World War, which turned out to be the key phase in the development of school meals. In the First World War, under the 1906 Act and the regulations which followed, the school meals were essentially permissive, that they could be provided, but they definitely weren't always. And so the provision was very, very spotty at best, if I can put it that way. Pre-war, so 1939, 157 out of 315 LEAs were providing free school meals for a very small group of the population. But the Second World War, particularly from 1940, brought about a new social consciousness, awareness, partly a sense of equality of sacrifice, but also in the context of increasing food rationing from 1940 onwards. And the percentage of school children receiving free school meals during this period began to grow. Particularly from 1940, Clement Attlee, who himself had been instrumental as a local politician in the 1920s in his local area in supporting school meals, became Lord Privy Seal and was really very strong in supporting the growth of awareness in school policy. As it said, as has been demonstrated, the school meal is educational, both from the point of view of nutrition, and nutrition was a key thing which policymakers became very concerned with, and also manners. And these became key aspects of the provision of school meals. And yet at the same time, there were some signs of reluctance, a lack of demand, a view that this should not be forced on pupils. So again, in this Food Policy Committee, the reluctance of many parents to allow their children to feed at school was a factor to be considered. At present, free meals were associated by many parents with the taint of charity, and that goes back to the prehistory in the 19th century, when it was associated with the Poor Law, and that was a long-standing issue. That became less strong in the Second World War, but re-emerged later on, I think. So signs of equality of sacrifice. The Ministry of Food became very intrusive during this period, and even took itself upon itself to start to visit universities, and even some of the elite Oxford colleges. We're on the next page here. So Magdalen College, Oxford, these visitors said there was much too much difference made for High Table. They discovered that High Table, for the Dons, had cheese served 10 times in 1 week by looking through the menu book. So they should do away with different meals for High Table. And that led to indignant messages that we were going towards totalitarianism in policy. And even the public schools started to feel left out from the increasing attention given to school meals. On the next page, Hugh Lyon of Rugby School said that children at day schools are at present getting an advantage in that they can get midday meals without having to surrender their coupons, rationing coupons. What I'm asking is whether the same kind of compensating privilege could be given to boys and girls in boarding schools. Next page. There was a sense in this that this was forced feeding, but also at the same time that it was patriotic and part of the war effort to have food. And even that food waste was really going into Hitler's hands. The scientific committee from Cambridge in 1942, the boy who rejects good food is as much the Führer's friend as any brown-shirted member of the Hitler Jugend, and should be told so. But at the same time, the reluctance of demand. A Board of Education official noted still the children I saw recently were merely picking at very small helpings of cold, soppy, unattractive looking food. Next slide. It was the 1944 Education Act that really was a turning point, really developing from the changing atmosphere of the war itself. Under Section 49 was the provision awarded to state schools, but a little
I think we may have lost Gary.
Next slide.
Can we hear you again?
Next slide. Yeah. Are you okay? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay. So after the war, there was a view that had emerged from these debates that school meals were a social institution. For example, the Swansea Education Department said that as a result of the impact of war, the provision of meals had changed from a service carrying the stigma of charity and condemned often to ramshackle and insalubrious premises, inevitably associated with the soup kitchen, to a social and educational function, which embraces all classes of children and all types of schools, and is accepted as part of the ordinary fabric of community living, as practiced during childhood. And it's undoubtedly still a strong sense of the hunger of many poor children, which you can see from Alan Johnson's excellent memoir, This Boy. From the time we started school, we qualified for free school meals and were under instructions from his mother to eat as much as we could in case there wasn't anything for us when we got home. And that was in London in the 1950s and 60s. But even from that time, on the next slide, signs of a failure of demand. One mother wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, no less, not the Minister of Education, to say that her daughters consider it extremely embarrassing to have free dinners. And she's asked the local authority if it would be possible for the two younger children to have them instead, because she had 5 children at school. And can this be changed? But also at the same time, the withdrawal of supply. And this is happening in the context of a rapidly increasing educational expenditure as early as the 1950s and 1960s, because the amount of money being given in other areas was going up so much. The keenness on the part of policymakers to find cuts from elsewhere, and school meals were a very likely thing to go for. So the Treasury view in 1960, under Section 6 here, in the modern social context and within the government's general philosophy, there seems no reason why parents whose means allow should not pay the full cost. School meals are about the only item of present educational expenditure where we can legitimately seek to remove some of the cost from the exchequer without reducing the standards of education proper. It was noted that there was actually a very low take-up of free school meals to parents with low incomes. Only about half of those eligible for free school meals were actually taking them. And so LEAs were trying to give attention to methods of avoiding embarrassment to children taking free meals and preventing their being identified by their fellows. There is in this already, I think, as with some of the earlier cases, a sense of a manipulation of supply and demand going on at the same time. And then the withdrawal of supply accelerating in the 1970s, so that if you see on the next page, the Treasury in the 1977, in the midst of economic crisis, saying that LEAs should be responsible for school meals, with the government setting nutritional standards and charges, but taking the provision out of central educational expenditure. And a wonderful quote, the original purpose of the service itself may even have become anachronistic. Do parents really need to be relieved of responsibility for providing their children with their main meal of the day? Are local authorities really not responsible enough to settle the nutritional standards of the meal and the form of a charge for it, for that matter, without detailed direction from the centre? I could go on. In 1977, there were still over 6 million school meals provided every day, 10% for teachers and supervisors, only 25% free for children from low-income families, 65% at a standard charge for children, and that was 25 pence in September 1977, with a net expenditure of around about 220 million. And again, according to the Treasury, again, sort of thinking for the future, well, should even LEAs be responsible for this? The alternative would be for local authorities to provide tables and chairs and supervision, but to require pupils either to go home or to bring their own packed lunches to school. And if you look at the next page, following this, I think, and I think you could already see in the 1970s, the loss of historical vision of what school meals were supposed to provide. The social purposes which were pointed to earlier in the century, the point about nutrition being a very important part of education itself, that school meals were an important part of the curriculum. All of those kinds of senses seem to have been lost in this discourse by the 1970s, 1980s. I think in the last few years, we can see it, we already saw it earlier on, growing recognition of a problem, of a loss, and some very important local and school-based initiatives, but hardly really a strong sense of a national strategy built on the history, but also recognizing the ways in which society has changed since. So in conclusion, on the final page, you can see a balance, a shifting balance, a negotiation, but often a conflict between notions of demand and supply, a rise of school meals through the Second World War, under the 1944 Education Act establishing itself as a compulsory and comprehensive service with provision for free school meals for low-income families, not just on the grounds of health as it had been before, and a failure of demand and a withdrawal of supply from the 1950s onwards, before the Conservative governments of the 1980s and 1990s, leading to the need for a new balance to be achieved, if we possibly can, for the 21st century. Thanks very much indeed. Hope I kept the time.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much.
Okay. Could you hear me, lads? That was
yes, we could hear you. That was great. Thank you very much. Right. Sorry, let me just get rid of that screen. You, Yinka, welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So, yeah, welcome, Yinka. Please go ahead. Sorry, just checking. Deborah's still not here. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you. So my presentation is looking at the situation in Bradford. I'm interested in how policies become enacted, and I'm particularly interested in discourse and how discourses construct people, particularly children. So I'm wanting to look at this period based on some minutes of the Education Committee and the Elementary Education Subcommittee of Bradford from 1904 to 1908. And in particular, today I'll be talking about some extracts of that from 1904 and how the discourse work that was happening there in the minutes. And I should be looking at a case study of what happened to a particular family in 1907 to 1908. So I take a critical discourse analysis approach to looking at archival material. I'm interested in the discursive exercise of power and how that's captured in the official discourses, how people, groups, phenomena, processes, events are named and characterized, the use of language to mitigate or intensify, particularly around emotion, and also where the silences and the subjugated discourses are in a lot of official documentation. I come from a background where I have a historical background, but also a background in childhood studies. So I think it's really important to recognise that children can't be ever understood as a group by themselves, that they are part of a generational structure. And certainly I think education in particular not only constructs the child, but constructs parents and communities via their policy work. So if we go to 1904, and there is work being done within the Education Committee to establish the feeding of hungry children as a field of action that the council should be taking action on. And I'm going to particularly look at the three examples, looking at some school returns, a report of the Cinderella Club that was mentioned earlier, and the categories of parents that were constructed and enacted by the guardians, the plural. So in 1904, the Education Committee began the work of pulling together intelligence about hungry children in day schools and the idea of devising measures for their relief. And so the 14th of October, they had a special meeting of the committee, but they adjourned that meeting to the following Thursday for two reasons. One, to make sure that the chairman of the Board of Guardians and the chairman and secretary of the Cinderella Club could be invited to be present. And two, to give the committee secretary time to send out a circular to all elementary schools in the city asking for information about certain points. Now, annoyingly, there isn't much detail, there isn't any detail about how they came upon those points, but when I go to the next meeting on the following Thursday, we see the results of that. So I've reproduced here 3 of the pages. There's actually 6 pages of report. And they've decided to ask the schools to report on the following categories, these key terms. How many children are ill-clothed, ill-shod, underfed, breakfastless, and destitute? And I think that's a really interesting, categories to have. So they're based on teachers' judgment. It's a very quick turnaround to get that information, and based on the appearance of the children and the implicit actions and inaction of the parents in the idea of underfed and missing breakfast. And obviously there's a focus is wider than food, taking in clothing and shoes. So the next return that is mentioned in that meeting is the report of the Cinderella Club, which is tabled and it's reproduced in its entirety. And it's a report written by W. Leach and Harry Smith, who were members of the Cinderella Club and of the Independent Labour Party. And I find it interesting because they introduce this idea of the gradations of being unfed, underfed, seriously underfed, permanently underfed. And being in the critical discourse analysis, there's intertextuality here. They are making links to terms like physical efficiency that come from Roundtree. But it's interesting because that efficiency word is also part of a different discourse, which is rooted in a discourse of racial deterioration, also based on eugenics. So it's an interesting word, and you can argue about how it's being used. There's a construction of the child here. The emotional toll is mentioned, the idea of being in very dire distress. So that is quite different. Emotion doesn't come into the returns that we've seen from the schools because they weren't asked about it. So parent in poverty, this is how they've actually structured the report, the Cinderella Club. So there are 7 questions, and it's not actually made explicit in the minutes whether these are questions that the Cinderella have used to frame their response, or if there were questions that were actually set to them. But I do think they're, again, very interesting, particularly the final 3, which are very much about not just the child, but the conditions of the families too. So if we think about what's happening here, there's a discursive construction of the parent in poverty as an object of knowledge, and the use of language here. So they're constructing categories of parents and of hungry children, but those constructions are made by others of those people, not their own constructions. Questions 5 and 6, I think, draw on dominant discourses about the deserving poor, that might mitigate judgment about the state of their children, so the widow or the unemployed. And it's interesting that the answers of the Cinderella Club force a distinct widening of these groups discursively. So we have deserted wives, families where the father is incapacitated, and the idea of being wholly or partially unemployed. There's a real reframing of the last question. They talk about the causes of poverty, not just the conditions of poverty. In constructing the child as an object of knowledge, I think that's, again, interesting. There's a division here, dividing and categorizing the child that is sanctioned to be hungry, that actually you have some business being hungry, and the unsanctioned hungry child, and a justification of the bureaucracy of intervention to deal with these different categories of hungry child and different types of parent. So the relationship between the poverty and parenting, I think, is very much judged from a specific discursive lens and from a very much top-down perspective. So they do, in their conclusions, acknowledge the discourses of blame, which are very prevalent in society, but they do also then put forward counter-arguments about cause. And in widening that discussion, you know, they do actually say that they are taking on responsibility, they are making serious allegations as to social conditions. So they're not ignoring. It's not just relief of the symptoms of the poor, it's actually acknowledging some of the causes of poverty. So moving on into 1905, the Education Committee notes how the guardians, who still at this time have responsibility for feeding hungry children, are classifying the children. And the problematic group are those whose parents are capable of having made provision and have neglected to do so. And there's a drive very much to sort and classify, because there seems to be almost a terror of providing meals to parents in this category by accident, and almost be happy to avoid feeding some children if it means that you don't accidentally feed children whose parents don't deserve their children to be fed. So the argument, the counter discourse, is also then noted in March 1906, because the guardians who are providing meals for children whose parents are considered neglectful can also then take their parents to court and recover the costs. And the deputation of socialist women workers put forward a resolution protesting against the action of the guardians and asking for the local authority to take responsibility away from that for feeding necessitous children. Now, again, the 1906, 1905, and beginning of 1907, you've got a mishmash of what's actually being provided, and different people who are also, who are part of the Education Committee arguing from different points. So H.V. Priestman, who was on the council, he debated the need to distinguish between children starving by not fault of their parents and those starving because of neglectful parents. This was blown out of the water really by the work of Dr. Crowley. In his research, concluded that there was a minimum of 6,000 and a maximum of 21,000 of Bradford's 55,000 school children who actually required feeding. In October 1907, Labour reports that when municipal school feeding started in Bradford, the new authority inherited only just over 600 children from the guardians. So this demonstrates the scale of the failure before the enactment of the 1906 Act. So we get to 1907 and Bradford is finally poised to launch their school feeding programme, having trialled it in the earlier part of the year. And to put my fragrant Star Wars analogy here, was it a new hope or is it Attack of the Clones? Were things going to change, particularly for parents in this potentially problematic and contested space, or was it going to be more of the same? So I want to think about the Oxleys in particular. So the local authority role in the actual Act and the provision of the Act, the second section is about recovery of the cost of meals. And basically it's putting that responsibility on the local authority that if a payment is not made by a parent, unless they are satisfied that that parent is unable to pay by reasons of circumstances other than their own fault, they've got to actually recover that as a civil debt. The parents will not be disenfranchised, but it's basically following the same principles that was happening before. And it also puts that onus on the local authority to investigate the circumstance. Harry Hendrick, writing about this, the School Meals Act as this act of social reform, he's more cynical, and he makes this wonderful quote, the school stands like a colossus whose gaze extends far beyond the horizon. So the gaze of school meals is not just the child but the parent. I think that kind of echoes what we've heard already, But my question is what are the effects of that gaze? What does it feel like to be under that gaze, and how accurate is that gaze? So what's really interesting to me is how discourses become these bureaucratic processes, and that they become technologies of power. And you can start to see this in the canteen committee, becomes a subcommittee of the elementary education subcommittee. And you start to see repeatedly these phrases put in as reports into the minutes, amongst other different reports on other aspects of what the canteen committee was doing. So it's when there were applications came in for free meals, they were considered, dealt with, most of them were renewed, but then they would start to actually name children. So it would be first and surnames of children. They're going to provide the meal, dinners, but recover the cost. Some were going to recover 1 penny, some would be the full cost. Then as the months go on, you start to see it was resolved within the city council to recommended to take police court proceedings. And again, the names and surnames of the children. And then you start to see further in the view, basically, because of explanations given by the parents, notices, basically the legal action is now abandoned. So I wanted to look at a particular case. So one of the early cases I came across was of the Oxleys, Samuel, Charlie and Bartholomew Oxley. So a month before the school meal service was launched, they apply, well, the family applies for dinners, but the decision is made to recover the cost. 21st of January, to take court proceedings. 2nd of April, they're going to go to the magistrate, and then 9th of April, we find that the father had recently died. So I looked for the Oxleys. Who were they? So I found them in the 1901 census. They lived at 6 St George's Street, Bradford. And I looked at the schools that were around them, and they still exist today. So St Mary's Roman Catholic School, St Mary's Leicesterdike, and Bowling Lane. These are some of the schools with the highest returns of poverty that we saw in 1904. St Mary's in particular, the highest in the city. But when we look at this, I also found the death certificate, well, not the certificate, the death record for Bartholomew Oxley. So what we see is it's a large family in 1901. He died not in April or March even of 1908, but he actually had died in the last quarter of 1907. So what was the view like from the other side? So if the children started having meals on the 28th of October, that was 165 days from the start of service till the 9th of April, nearly 24 weeks of accumulating debt, and 79 days for a widow to be spent under threat of court proceedings. So my question really was, what did school meals mean for the children of the Oxley family and for Miriam, the mother of the Oxley family? How did they respond to them? How did they feel? How did they speak of this at the time and then in the future? And I think it really highlights to me this missing discourse strand relating to the emotional and cognitive labour of poverty, particularly through the process, people who are processed through the bureaucracy. And the picture there is not of any of the Oxleys, but this is a picture of my grandfather in the front row at the extreme right of the screen. He was born in September 1904, and in the 1970s and 80s, he still talked about the horror of debt. So this to me, this is, I think, what I would like to be able to research more and think about. And definitely, when I look now and think about some of the discourses we're hearing today from people like Marcus Rashford, I think the same arguments have been happening again and again. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. So we'll move to our final paper of the afternoon, which is going to be another contemporary reflection, this time based on Gopinder Lally's research into school restaurants. Gopinder is senior lecturer in education and inclusion at the University of Wolverhampton and an expert on school restaurants, and seems to have a book out last year and a book out next year, which is pretty good going, I think. So Schools, Food and Social Learning, a Routledge book, looks very interesting. And I think you're writing another one at the moment as well. Gopinda, do you want to unmute?
Hi, sorry about that. Is that okay? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Can you see this? Can you see my screen as well?
Yep, that's all good.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll just get started then.
But you need, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm Gopinda, and thank you today for this opportunity to join the session. And I'd like to introduce you to my research. And I'm reflecting here on my doctoral thesis, which was I defended in 2017. It's been really interesting listening into those historians here today, as well as more contemporary discussions. I'm also a kind of sociologist of education, and I've been researching the school food space for some time now. I would like to also say that I'm kind of a training as an ethnographer, so it's something I've been working on, and it's mainly interested in school dining halls. And we talk about the sensory nature of eating in particular. You know, we talked about smell and taste, and it's also about space. And we've also seen examples of how, you know, schools are being used as food banks. So this is something that is of interest to me. So I want to talk about what we see on the screen here. First of all, is a modern dining space, and I'll kind of draw on an example of this. Is just taken from a kind of a modern academy school, but I do want to kind of share examples of you know, the research from the school in which I carried out the ethnography, and the main purpose, I guess, was to investigate the impact of the food environment and social learning. A school that I chose to call Pear Tree Academy. The motivation behind this, it was part of a studentship from the University of Leicester, and I was presented with a paragraph, a writing based on an idea of kind of trying to explore the links between food and learning. So being in education, of course, that was of interest to me, and I used to kind of work in further education colleges with disaffected young people for quite some time. I used to spend the best part of half an hour just trying to calm them down from climbing the walls after the consumption of energy drinks. So for that reason, this studentship appealed to me. And you know, having worked in schools before, it was just kind of this informal learning spaces was an interest area. And having done kind of studied social and cultural theory, it kind of sparked interest. So it was based. My research was conducted in one school, right, and for a period, for a kind of extended period throughout the PhD, and speaking with conversations with my supervisor, trying to draw links between food and learning, going to be very difficult and also very ambitious. And we've seen more studies recently that explore those very investigations. So more so from psychologists looking at breakfast and education attainment. I've been following that work closely too, but my argument is that so many different variables involved in trying to make, you know, establish such links. So for instance, you know, I'll throw the question out there: do 5 fruits and veg equate to better learning? in terms of attainment and grades, it's difficult to make those links. What we do know is that, you know, we cannot learn on hungry kind of in a hungry stomach. So that's the kind of basis on which we move forward here. So I wanted to explore the social and life skills which pupils develop through meeting, making choices, eating, and talking together in an inviting restaurant culture rather than school canteen. So essentially, at Pear Tree Academy, the school organised a canteen as a restaurant, and that was what it was called. And I'd get slapped on the wrist for saying anything otherwise. So I'd like you guys now to reflect, just briefly. What do you remember about your school dining experience, and whether that's in the UK and whether that's outside of the UK. What do you remember and what do you recall? All I can do right now, very subjectively and very anecdotally, report on what I remember as school dining. And the picture I present with you here is exactly what I remember of my school dining experience. So this is a typical school lunch in a primary school in the UK. And actually, whilst we've seen many examples of how school dining has changed in schools, in particular in the modern day, the image I present to you today is still very much commonplace in a number of schools. Okay, and this is in a primary setting in particular. So that's ages from 4 to 11 years old. And what you see here is not a fixed dining space, but we see a mobile space where there are wooden beams. We would typically participate in physical education in this space. We typically participate in assembly every morning in this space, right? So I'd be sitting on the floor in this space, I'd be running around in this space, and at lunch I'd be eating here. At the end of that time, we'd be putting the chairs away. And that's my memory, and my kind of, and it's quite. I would like to admit, actually, it was quite a challenging meal time for me. I used to take a packed lunch from what kind of have sandwiches. I wasn't on the free school meals register as such, but we would have sandwiches at lunchtime. And again, that's something I remember, and I do remember the smells and not being very pleasant in my experience. But as I moved through to secondary education, I remember a lot more options being available with hot dinners being served. So in my primary school, we never had a canteen as such. We'd typically bring in a packed lunch. Just like my 7-year-old daughter now, in her junior school, they haven't got canteen facilities. So they take in packed lunches. And again, the situation is very different in secondary schools. But my research was done in an all-through academy school, which is from the ages of 3 up until 18. So what I want to present you with now is an image which has been pixelated for reasons of anonymity and ethics. But this is a school restaurant at Pear Tree Academy. Okay. Now what you see is skylights, and you can see a very open and airy space. To the right is a school, is the buffet, and in the middle you can see, of course, tables, chairs, which are of varied shapes and colours in some cases. The other thing to note is there are 100 children and young people that are enrolled on the school register in this academy school. So school lunch there is no school lunch hour, for instance. School lunch is staggered, beginning at 11:15 and finishing at 2:15. And there are phases of pupils that enter the school dining hall, or should I say restaurant. So there's 2 year groups that enter at one time. They have to queue up, eat, all within 20 minutes, each group. So that brings about its own challenges, of course. The other thing I want to point out here is you should be able to see some classrooms at the back end of the image, on the ground floor first of all. Those are classrooms. And as you move through towards the left-hand side, that is the staff room. and also the principal's office is located there. So it's kind of an open plan, is how we think of our modern day kitchen dining in the household, for example. On the second, on the first floor, right? So the ground floor is a school. The classrooms on the second, on the first floor, you'll see the library, right? And again, it's also designed as like a mezzanine. So another thing I should mention here, the Academy School was part funded by a local business, and this is based in the Midlands, and the business is one of food manufacturing. So the school was designed with the ethos of food in mind. The school was rebuilt in 2007. The principal, the deputy principal as well, were all hired, and the catering managers were all hired with some kind of food industry background. So the catering manager had never worked a day in a school before. The principal and the deputy head had worked with young people who had come from disaffected backgrounds. And the school where I undertook the study was an inner city school, but the number of pupils registered for free school meals and the pupil premium was significantly above the national average. Now,
Gopinder, can I just interrupt you? I don't think we can't see the pictures you're talking about. I did send you a message. Sorry.
Oh, it's not. Sorry.
We're still on the front page. Just
okay.
Given that you're talking so much about the images, it might be nice to see them. Thank you.
Sorry. I'm using split screen. Probably why. Sorry. Can you see the images moving now?
Yeah. So now we can see the school hall with the gym in the background.
Yeah. So this is the one I was referring to as my school dining experience, and the next one which is the image which I'm referring to at the moment is the school restaurant where I conducted my PhD. Okay, sorry about that. So if I continue from this point, what I want to say is the central line of argument for my thesis was this tension between whether the school was being used as a space for socialization and social learning, or whether the surveillance that was shaping the day-to-day policing of activities in the restaurant were hindering those social learning opportunities from taking place. Inevitably, I ended up exploring this notion of the pedagogic meal, which was originally coined in 1970s Sweden, and this idea being that the school meal is used as a teaching occasion. And then I began to look at, led me to working, reading up on the work of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, and looking at surveillance, kind of looking at discipline, looking at notions of training, how we can use this space to train pupils in terms of etiquette and manners. So school dining, how it was very different in this particular school compared to my experience was that they'd have proper cutlery and hot plates for eating rather than kind of what I call flight trays. And I want to kind of move forward now, having described a bit about the school. So, as I alluded to earlier, my interest was very much in food and learning, but largely, should I say, on the social context of eating. What do we know about the social aspect of dining? Now, although most kind of staff had a good understanding of how to practice a pedagogic meal, this was a concept that was first coined in Sweden in the 70s. Sorry, I was just looking through the chat there. I'll continue. And very few studies, discuss the social context of eating, of mealtime, school mealtime in particular. And clearly, there's a space for doing some more research on this area. And then, when I was undertaking the study, a couple of questions I had in mind were: firstly, how could I portray the account of the school restaurant at Pear Tree Academy? And second, how could I judge whether or not learning was actually taking place, or social learning more specifically was taking place in the school restaurant? Just to structure this discussion a little bit more, my main research question was the impact of food, the impact of the food environment upon social learning, from which I had two sub-questions. How do eating behaviours impact on learning development? And how do teachers promote social learning and learning opportunities within a food environment? Now, the full PhD thesis is available online for any further viewing. The next image, which I do have permission to share, is from Pear Tree Academy. And you can take a little bit of a closer look from a slightly different angle of the restaurant, where you can see flowers on the table, fresh fruit and vegetables. You can see it's very open, an open space. And of course, the principal to the right-hand side in pink. And a lot in front of the principal, you'll see a set of stairs which lead directly to the first floor, as I was describing earlier. And where the principal is stood, she stood directly in front of her own office. So this is what I mean about this kind of almost policing of mealtime. As soon as you enter the school, so to the left of this image is the entrance to the school. So as soon as you enter, you step into the school restaurant. Okay, you cannot. It's a space that can't be avoided. So I used to typically see, as children entered, there'd be members of staff that would kind of intervene and kind of just engage with pupils and say, you're late, or are you okay? So, and this was purposefully designed in this way. So just moving on then, I've spoken about social learning quite consistently throughout now. So now, of course, there are theoretical definitions that exist already on social learning, most notably by Bandura. But what I want to mention, what I want to kind of identify is, I'm talking more about social skills here. So I want to take the definition of Dalton, who defined social as society, concerned with mutual relations of human beings, living in organized communities, and skill as the expertness and practiced ability. So by this, the term social suggests that we need some rules by which to live if we are going to get on with those around us. And this is something I want to kind of unpack a little bit more, because I believe, as a shy pupil, as a young person, I believe that school mealtime is such a wonderful opportunity. And I would like to argue that school mealtime is an opportunity, it is a teaching occasion in some way. It is, of course, a busy and fluid environment, in terms of both noise, pollution, and the number of people using the space at one given time. But I think there's something more to be said about that. And the term skill suggests a measure of being an expert or having practiced something to the point of being expert. So again, just to move forward there, before I kind of delve a little bit further into the notions of what I mean by expert ability or levels of competence, I'd like to kind of just draw on this notion of commensality here. And Professor Alan Ward, based at University of Manchester, who is a professor of sociology, has researched food consumption, kind of in great detail, of course. And he introduced this notion of commensality, which he refers to in his work. This is about eating at the same table, and the essence by which we kind of school meals are. We'd like to think that this is why they're introduced and organised in the way they are. So, in the past decade, commensality has been called upon by a number of scholars, of course, to help provide a platform of how things should appear in such settings, including schools in particular. So, reconsidering school meals as social events. My apologies in advance. The kids are coming in from school now, the 2-year-old and 7-year-old, so there may be a bit of noise in the background, guys, and some probably the little one probably wanting to introduce herself. But anyway, so what I want to say is, of course, I'm no historian, but those historians that surround me here today will know that historically, school mealtime, I believe, has been introduced, as a solution to a problem, right? What we could consider, what we need, or I guess I could say what we need to consider, and I know you're kind of, I'm kind of preaching to the converted here, is that we need to consider school meals as social events, as just a meal in itself, rather than, oh, here's a problem, let's try and address it. And that's something that I feel quite strongly about as well. Just moving on then. So the Dreyfus model, this is what I mean by social learning. So how can I measure that? It's something I've quite try to question, and how, as I make progression in my own research and my own thinking, how can I then move forward? How can we measure whether learning is taking place? So this model, I consider myself to be in the novice stage as a young person, right? Once upon a time. But equally, some young people are able to socialize more easily than others. So, it's about learning from one another. And again, I believe that this model reflects the diverse audience and the social participants during mealtime in particular. So that's just something I've been thinking of more recently as I develop further proposals for research. And the main, as I mentioned earlier, the central thread in my thesis was whether the school restaurant was being used as a community forum or surveillance mechanism. Just some couple of key quotes here. School principal. So why I came to this school? It was because I was able to drive the ethos of the school forward, of food forward. Actually, the senior management team will have some sort of interest in either food or behaviour. And also a field note. I've also noticed a camera in the restaurant, one which captures a whole school restaurant and reception area, as well as the main corridor. Now, this kind of draws me back to the work of Foucault and the panopticon, how we are, this kind of notion of self-surveillance, how we conform, but upon further investigation, I found that the camera wasn't actually on. There was no recording taking place. So, from that, I infer from that there's a level of surveillance shaping the day-to-day space and of mealtime. And just a couple of quotes from children here. So clearly, why are they making us rush? I'm going to leave this food. No, don't you dare. They can't do that. That's child abuse. I'm finishing my dinner, my pudding, how I want. This is an exchange between a couple of pupils, year 7 pupils, who are dining and being asked to eat as quickly as they can to make way for the year 9 group to enter. And that was something that I found quite interesting too as I moved through my research. So what are the recommendations that come about from this, kind of the so what question that I always ask myself? So prioritizing the school meal as an occasion, as a meal, more space and time to eat. Now I know that's problematic as there's more of a squeeze for space and places in schools. More communication between academic and non-academic staff. What I found, and this is quite a claim, but what I found with it, I often found myself observing that those teachers were more kind of the disciplinarians, and those, and that includes myself as an insider, because being an ex-teacher, I almost found myself kind of correcting, or not correcting, just training young people and how they should behave, and the non-academic staff, such as those who weren't formally trained as teachers, let's say, dinner supervisor, kind of lunchtime supervisors, to kind of, they were spending more time socializing with young people, such as talking about how the meals were, and not just that, but what they were doing later in that day, or what lesson they'd had, etc., etc. So the other thing is increasing the duration of lunch. and reconsidering, the main point there is reconsidering the school lunch as an act of commensality. And just coming on to the couple of more recently funded projects that I've been involved with, which are in progress. And one of which is another ethnography, but again, doing ethnography at a distance brings its own challenges. I've been recording interviews online, but again, this is just very much about kind of addressing the importance of holiday hunger, as well as trying to capture, which is the first project. And the second one is about trying to capture schools such as the one in Tower Hamlets and one we've kind of been introduced to earlier. And I know I spoke to Paul Jackson recently, who's the head teacher of that school. And this is another school. The second project is based on the Washington Academy in Lincolnshire, also very well known for their school food ethos. And that's something I'm interested in sharing the findings of in future talks. So what I want to do now is just kind of leave on screen some selected references from today's session and some of the papers which have come about. And there's a couple that came out this year. And I'm kind of writing a research monograph at the moment, which is titled Schools, Space and Culinary Capital, and which is due for publication next year. But I just wanted to say thank you for listening, guys, and apologies if that's kind of dragged on a little bit, and also apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning of the presentation. I've been using Microsoft Teams and convincing my institution also to invest in Zoom. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kapinda. Yeah, we're all, this brave new world of different platforms every day for different types of teaching / presenting.